The situation in Iran is rapidly deteriorating, and it's increasingly pulling the United States toward a military decision. Over the past several weeks, Iran has been rocked by large-scale protests. What began as public demonstrations has now escalated into a nationwide confrontation between the population and the state. The Iranian government has responded with force. Internet access has been cut across much of the country, journalists are restricted, and reliable information is hard to come by. But despite that blackout, one thing is clear: a broad crackdown is underway, and hundreds of protesters are believed to have been killed since late December. President Trump has taken notice, and he has issued direct warnings. Trump has said that if Iran's leadership continues to use violence against protesters, the United States will respond. Based on current trends, there is a meaningful chance that he follows through. If protests persist and the regime continues to use lethal force, the odds of a U.S. military strike are roughly 65%. So why would Trump act? From his perspective, the immediate risks are relatively contained. Iran is weaker than it has been in years, economically strained, politically brittle, and internally divided. Trump has authorized strikes against Iran before and faced few lasting consequences. U.S. forces are already positioned across the region, and Washington is confident it can defend its bases and support Israel if Iran retaliates. There's also a domestic political dimension. Trump's base has generally supported military actions that are fast, decisive, and limited in scope, especially when they don't involve long-term deployments or nation-building. A narrow strike on Iran would fit that mold. That said, Trump remains sensitive to the risk of being dragged into a prolonged conflict, which is one reason any action would likely be carefully calibrated. If a strike happens, it would almost certainly be limited. The U.S. would likely avoid Iran's nuclear facilities or core military infrastructure. Instead, the focus would be on internal security forces, particularly the Basij. These forces are central to the crackdown and symbolically tied to the regime's repression. The strike would be small and largely symbolic, but the message would be clear: continued violence against protesters will bring escalating consequences. Trump could frame the action as standing up for the Iranian people, supporting freedom without committing the U.S. to a full-scale war or a sustained bombing campaign. But Iran would not be able to simply absorb a strike and move on. If Tehran publicly acknowledges U.S. action, its military leadership would feel compelled to respond. At a moment of internal crisis, showing strength becomes essential. Any perception of weakness could fracture elite unity and embolden unrest at home. That response would likely be limited as well. Iran might target U.S. bases or naval assets in the Gulf, or strike at the reduced U.S. presence in Iraq or Syria. These actions would be calibrated, designed to save face and demonstrate resolve without triggering a direct, large-scale confrontation with the United States. Iran could also choose restraint. In the past, Tehran has sometimes downplayed or ignored symbolic U.S. actions to avoid escalation. The regime remains acutely aware that a shooting war with Washington would be devastating. There is, however, an alternative path. In roughly 35% of scenarios, a U.S. strike may be avoided altogether. In that case, de-escalation would likely run through Oman. Any agreement would be limited and temporary. It would not resolve broader issues like Iran's missile program, but it could buy time. The larger problem is this: even a U.S. strike is unlikely to change the regime's behavior. The Islamic Republic has lost much of its remaining legitimacy in the eyes of its population and appears willing to rely on force to stay in power. Security services are likely to continue killing protesters regardless of outside pressure. That leaves the door open to further U.S. actions, whether through additional strikes, tougher sanctions, or more aggressive enforcement of oil restrictions. If Trump escalates beyond an initial strike and Iran refuses to back down, the risk of a broader and more destructive confrontation increases sharply. That's what makes this moment so dangerous. The coming weeks could determine whether this crisis is contained or whether it becomes something much larger.